Recently, I started rebuilding my Nintendo 64 collection and even went as far to have a dedicated Nintendo 64 setup in my arcade here. And well, I am going to continue collecting physical games because I still love the idea of owning and having that physical copy of a game that I loved so much growing up. I also decided that I wanted to have a multi-cartridge for my Nintendo 64, and I started doing a bit of research, and you can go on Amazon and there's some that are, you know, as low as $70 and as high as $200. And so I wasn't necessarily too hot in spending that amount of money on something like this. So I went on AliExpress and found one that apparently does the same thing as those $200 cartridges for $25. And it was advertised as a 5001 multi-cartridge, but essentially it's just a Summer Cart 64. And so far, I'm incredibly happy with this purchase. And in this video, I'm going to go over why this was definitely worth the $25 and why you should consider having this in your N64 collection as well. So let's take a look. So to start, the packaging it was shipped in was pretty much just a generic brown box with an N64 sticker slapped on the side. And inside the box, nothing really to write home about. You're given essentially a imitation N64 cartridge. It also has a port for an SD card. It has another port, which again, I'm not too familiar with these, so I'm not going to tell you I know exactly what it is. I just left the sticker on that it shows there to not basically uncover. And there's also a bunch of different faceplate stickers you could put on this cartridge itself. For me to keep this simple, I've just left it blank, but they're there. There's like 4 of them or something that you can swap out or put on, just depending on what you want. That all advertise that it's a 5001 cartridge. Now, one of the concerns I did have was I read online that some of these multi-carts don't work with HDMI adapters for the N64. This was not a problem. I put it into my N64 and it must be running at a higher resolution than typical, because most of these multi-carts, as I understand, run at a lower resolution and these HDMI cords don't pick it up. Regardless, you pop it into the N64 and it turns out this isn't some weird generic 5001 cartridge. This is apparently the Summer Cart 64, which I did a bit of research on and sounded like a good deal. And there's a couple little special quirks about it that I'm gonna highlight in a sec that make this unique. Now, getting into this doesn't just have N64 games. This actually comes packed in with some Game Boy games, as well as Super Nintendo games, as well as of course, N64, for the most part, the bulk of the catalog. There's obviously some that are missing here. For some reason, there's no North American Ocarina of Time, or sorry, North American Majora's Mask, but there's the North American Ocarina of Time, but there's a European version of Majora's Mask, whatever. There's also some Japanese N64 games loaded into this. So you have a mixture of games on this device. One of my concerns though was, is this cheap cartridge, because again, this was 25 bucks, is it going to have issues with pumping out the actual ROMs that are loaded into it and playing them? So I tested multiple different games. I tested a bunch of mainline N64 games, as well as some that weren't as popular, ones that I played as a young kid, like A Bug's Life. And all of them seemed to play almost identical to how they would have played on the N64. I had no issues loading them, and no issues ultimately just generally playing through them. Now, one thing I will highlight though, for some reason, and I think this has to do with the adapter I'm using, but games that are expansion packed based games seem to have some weird screen flicker that occurs sometimes. On Perfect Dark, I definitely noticed it. And it's not game breaking, but you just notice every so often the screen kind of flickers black quickly. And it lasts like a fraction of a second, so it's not ultra noticeable, but it is something I did observe, and it seemed to be unique to the games that I played that were expansion pack based games. And again, I'm not sure. I think this has something to do with the way the adapter outputs everything, and it might be that this is those types of games are trying to output a stronger signal, but I could be wrong. Now, one of the things that I was concerned about with a multi-cart was, how is saving going to work? So When you play any N64 game, so just like a regular game that already had the save battery built into the cartridge, this mimics it almost one-to-one. So, for example, you go into a game, you make a save file, you save it, you restart the console, and then try to go back into that same game. It's like you're playing on that single cartridge because that save file is still there. Now, games that required a controller pack operate the same way. So if you need a controller pack to save your game or save your progress, this will still require a controller pack. I could not figure out any other way to do it. So this, in other words, each game you play through this cartridge plays as if it's only that game on the cartridge, and it saves and functions the same way, or it saves and uses the controller pack like it's supposed to. So I thought that was, in my opinion, something that's great, because this means that I'm not just going to be playing one-offs here that I kind of jump into and, you know, play every so often and, you know, never look back on because I'm not worried about save progress. This means I can actually invest time in certain games like Majora's Mask or even a game like Perfect Dark through this cartridge without having to worry about, is it going to save or track my progress? And there's even a folder to keep track of all your different save files, which is cool. Now, one of the big features, however, of the Summer Cart 64, as I understand, is that the devices that run Summer Cart 64, they also have the capability to do something special, which is run the Nintendo 64 disk drive. So it's not like there's some gargantuan back catalog of disk drive games that came out, but for me, these were definitely games that were a curiosity to me. So the fact that I'm able to play them seamlessly as if I have a full-blown N64 disk drive attached to my console when I don't, is awesome. Even you can mess around with some of the prototype openings for the North American version of the disk drive that never came out. You can also even check out the online adapter, or sorry, the online function that it had. Obviously, you're not going to have online functionality because that's shut down, but you can see how it looked, which is a cool piece of gaming history that for those of us in North America who either didn't have the means to go buy a secondhand disk drive or just never got to try it generally, this is a cool piece of almost childhood nostalgia that I looked forward to as a kid looking at in gaming magazines, that it's interesting that I get to play them on here and I get to see some of those disk drive games that I've only seen videos of or pictures and screenshots of in magazines growing up. So that was in my opinion, it wasn't something that made me motivated to get this cartridge, but it was, in my opinion, a nice little extra, and I felt a huge level of nostalgia just messing around with things that I thought I would never ever get to touch. So it was awesome that I was able to do that with this device. Now, the final thing that I want to highlight, this device comes, if you look at the sides, it comes with the SD card built in, and one of the things I read online that you have to be cautious of is kind of like the R36S. These SD cards aren't well built. There's a reason this thing was $25. So there's a chance that this may fail. That is a consideration for anybody purchasing this. However, at the $25 price tag, this is an absolute steal. And it also comes packed in with a little SD card adapter, so you can add more ROMs to the device if you want to. But as it stands, for everything that's packed in here that this comes with, I think this is huge bang for your buck. And I think for the $25 that I spent off of AliExpress, which as of looking at it even today, seemed to have been the best possible price I could get this thing for, I'm utterly impressed. I think that this is fantastic, and I look forward to using this for weeks and years and months and everything to come. So if you're in the market for a multi-cartridge, I would argue you can't go wrong with this device off of AliExpress.